So picture this. It's 1439, and a man is standing trial in a German court and is being sued over a completely secret project.
Right, the Strasbourg lawsuit. It's such a bizarre historical moment.
It really is. The plaintiffs are demanding to know what happened to all this missing lead, these hidden mirrors, and, they're basically alleging industrial espionage. And the man on trial is Johannes Gutenberg.
Yeah, and the funny thing is, he wasn't sitting there trying to invent the modern book. He was just a craftsman trying to make some money, and he ends up building a machine that, entirely by accident, completely tears Europe apart.
Exactly. Completely rewire the human brain. But, we always hear this lone genius myth, right? Like Gutenberg just woke up one day, had a light bulb moment, and poof, the printing press.
Right, which is just not how history works at all. It's so much messier. It's really this story of a guy frantically trying to synthesize like metallurgy, global trade routes, and just pure economic desperation. The historian Elizabeth Eisenstein actually has the perfect phrase for it. She called the printing press the ultimate agent of change.
Okay, let's unpack this, because our mission for this deep dive into the sources is to look way past the basic, middle school trivia about Gutenberg.
Right, we're going deeper.
Exactly. We want to dismantle the actual mechanics of the machine, explore the economic pressure cooker of the 15th century, and really trace how a repurposed wine press fundamentally altered the structure of human thought.
It's a huge topic.
It is. So to start, we really need to look at the world right before Gutenberg, because the late medieval period was just this massive bottleneck. It really feels like the press didn't just, happen to be invented. The economic conditions violently demanded it.
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, Europe in the 14th and 15th centuries was undergoing this really aggressive economic transformation.
Yeah.
Like the old, rigid feudal system.
Right, where everything is hyper-local.
Exactly. That was giving way to expansive trade and commerce. You suddenly have this massive expansion of an urban middle class. Merchants, bankers, lawyers, administrators.
And those are professions that rely entirely on recorded information.
100%. I mean, complex financial accounts spanning multiple borders require written ledgers. Local politics require written laws. The demand for text was suddenly no longer confined to just the clergy in a monastery.
And parallel to that commercial explosion, you have this massive intellectual boom. Starting around the 12th century, universities are just multiplying across Europe.
Bologna, Paris, Oxford.
Right. Thousands of students and scholars are suddenly clustering in these urban centers, and they all desperately need textbooks. But the supply chain for knowledge was completely, it was shattered.
Shattered is definitely the right word, because book production still relied almost entirely on hand copying.
Right.
Scribes were just meticulously writing out texts, letter by letter. And while it used to be just monks and isolated scriptoriums, it was increasingly becoming a secular profession in cities. But the process was just agonizingly slow.
And astronomically expensive.
Oh, yeah. A single comprehensive text could take a scribe the better part of a year to produce.
Which is just wild to think about today. I mean, for you listening, imagine having a global internet and this insatiable desire for information, but every single web page you want to read has to be physically painted by a monk.
That's a great way to put it.
You click a link, and 8 months later, a beautifully illuminated, insanely expensive piece of calfskin is delivered to your door. Like, the friction is just unbearable for a growing population.
It really was. And the desperation actually led to some highly organized but ultimately doomed stopgap measures.
Right, the Pisha system.
Yes, the Pisha system at the universities. Basically, stationers would take a master copy of a textbook, literally unbind it, and rent out individual sections.
The Pisha.
Exactly. They'd rent them out to students or copyists, so multiple people could copy different chapters of the same book at the exact same time.
Which is a clever workflow optimization, sure.
It is.
Yeah.
But it's still entirely constrained by human muscle and time. It's not a technological leap.
Right. But before we get to the mechanical leap, our sources point out an earlier structural innovation that I think gets overlooked a lot. The actual format of the book itself had to change.
Oh, the codex.
Yeah, because if Europeans were still reading from scrolls in the 15th century, Gutenberg's press would have been physically impossible.
It's arguably the most critical precursor to mechanical printing. The transition from the scroll to the Roman-era codex, which is just the format of discrete bound pages we use today. It completely replaced the ancient scroll by around 500 AD.
Let's talk about the geometry of that, because if I have a continuous 20-foot scroll, Finding a specific argument in the middle means unwinding the entire fragile document.
Right, it's linear access.
Exactly. But a codex allows for rapid random access. You just flip right to page 150. But it's more than just navigation, isn't it? It's about surface area.
That is exactly the point. The codex allows a reader, and eventually a printer, to use both sides of the writing material. The recto, the front, and the verso, the back.
Because with the scroll, you almost never write on the back.
Right, because it would just rub against itself when you roll it up and destroy the ink. So the codex maximizes your expensive materials. But mechanically speaking, if you're going to engineer a heavy press that exerts massive downward pressure on a flat surface, you need a flat, discrete target.
Right. A thick, rolled-up cylinder of parchment is a dead end for a flatbed press. It would just crush it.
Exactly. The codex provided the perfect geometric canvas for mechanization.
So, okay, late medieval Europe has the optimal geometry in the codex, and they have this excruciating demand for texts. But the raw materials to feed a mechanical press didn't exist locally.
No, not at all.
Because hand copying used parchment or vellum, which are treated animal skins, and if you're going to mass produce 10,000 books, you can't slaughter 50,000 sheep to do it. The math simply doesn't work.
It's an ecological and economic impossibility. Which brings us to the global puzzle pieces that had to fall into place before Gutenberg could even start his experiments. The printing press is entirely a synthesis of global technologies.
Right.
And the most vital one is paper. European printing without cheap, abundant paper is a complete non-starter. And Chinese papermaking was this highly developed craft long before it reached Europe. The journey of paper is just a remarkable story of cross-cultural transfer.
It moved along the Silk Road, right?
It did. And during the Islamic Golden Age, Arab Muslims adopted the Chinese craft and heavily expanded production across the Muslim world. And they didn't just act as, passive couriers. They innovated.
Right. The sources mention Fatimid Egypt.
Yeah, we have clear evidence that during the Fatimid era, there was widespread use of paper, and they were even using block printing techniques to reproduce passages of the Quran on paper strips.
Wow.
Yeah, they were addressing their own massive demand for texts long before Europe felt the squeeze.
But the critical leap that made paper viable for a printing revolution in Europe was industrialization. And that happened when paper tech finally hit the Italian peninsula in the late 13th century.
The mechanization of papermaking. A huge deal. The Italians, specifically in centers like Fabriano, took the manual craft of macerating rags to create paper pulp, and they hooked it up to water power.
Right, using water wheels.
Exactly. The first certain evidence of water-powered paper mills dates to 1282. They used these cams attached to water wheels to drive heavy wooden trip hammers, so they could pound hemp and linen rags into pulp at a massive industrial scale.
And the economic impact of hooking paper up to a water wheel is just staggering. The texts show that these mechanized mills drop the price of paper to roughly 1/6 the cost of parchment.
1/6.
Which is incredible. You finally have a substrate cheap enough to justify the immense setup costs of a print run.
Yet even with cheap paper and the codex format, the actual mechanism of transferring text required a conceptual breakthrough. And here, we just have to acknowledge that Europe was centuries behind East Asia.
Yeah.
Johannes Gutenberg did not invent movable type.
That is a fact that completely shatters the Eurocentric history most of us were taught.
Oh, absolutely.
The concept of breaking text down into individual, reusable characters movable type was invented by a Chinese engineer named Bi Sheng in the 11th century during the Song Dynasty, and he used baked clay.
Right. And following Bi Sheng, we see wooden movable type by Wang Zhen in the 13th century. But the closest parallel to Gutenberg's ultimate achievement actually happened in Korea.
The Jikji.
Yes. The oldest surviving book printed with cast metal movable type is the Jikji, printed during the Goryeo dynasty in 1377.
That is nearly 70 years before Gutenberg's workshop in Mainz. So the immediate glaring question is, if China and Korea possessed metal movable type decades or even centuries earlier, why didn't the explosive societal rewiring printing revolution occur there? Why didn't the Jikji trigger the exact same massive upheaval that the Gutenberg Bible did?
It's a great question, and it raises this really important point about the intersection of technology and linguistics. The scholars in our source material suggest that the hurdle wasn't mechanical at all. It was typographical.
Right.
Logographic writing systems, like the Chinese characters used in both Chinese and ancient Korean texts, contain thousands upon thousands of unique symbols.
The logistics of that are just a nightmare for a typesetter.
Precisely the issue. Imagine walking into a Chinese print shop. To print a standard text, a compositor might need a working inventory of 20,000 to 50,000 individual character blocks.
Wow.
The physical space required to store them, the massive labor just to cast them all, and the sheer cognitive load of organizing and retrieving them to set a single page. It made the process incredibly cumbersome.
I can't even imagine trying to organize 50,000 tiny blocks of metal.
Right, so it was often just more efficient for East Asian printers to stick with whole-page woodblock printing, where a master carver just engraves an entire page onto a single piece of wood.
Which gives Gutenberg the ultimate cheat code, the Latin alphabet.
The alphabet advantage is massive. It really is. Gutenberg only needed to cast a few dozen letters, some punctuation marks, and a handful of common ligatures.
Ligatures being like two letters merged together.
Right. So with an inventory of maybe 300 unique shapes total, he could represent any word, any concept, and any language that utilized the Latin script. The sorting and retrieving process suddenly becomes manageable for a single human being standing in front of a type case.
Okay, let's look at the board. We have soaring demand from universities and merchants. We have the efficient codex format. We have water-powered mills churning out incredibly cheap paper. And we have an alphabet mathematically optimized for movable type.
All the pieces are there.
All the precursors exist. We just need the person to physically engineer the solution.
Enter the goldsmith from Mainz.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because Gutenberg didn't work in a vacuum, and he was highly paranoid about protecting his intellectual property. Like you mentioned at the start, we mainly know about his early 1436 experiments because of that 1439 lawsuit in Strasbourg.
The lawsuit provides this wonderful, gritty look into the realities of 15th century innovation. Gutenberg formed a syndicate with Andreas Gritzen, who was a gem cutter, and Andreas Heilmann, who owned a paper mill.
Just look at that team. You have a man who shapes highly precise, tiny objects, and a man who commands an industrial supply of paper. It's an incredibly strategic vertical integration.
It was a serious medieval tech startup. And when Dritzen died, his heirs sued to be let into the secret partnership. And the witness testimonies are just full of these cryptic references.
Right, the missing lead.
Yeah, they talk about Gutenberg instructing his men to dismantle a press so no one could see how it worked. They mention melting down pieces of metal. They talk about a mysterious device with 4 pieces. It's pure industrial espionage at the dawn of the modern era.
But the key to Gutenberg's ultimate success wasn't his ability to keep a secret. It was his specific professional background, because he was a trained goldsmith.
That metallurgical expertise was the absolute linchpin. We so often focus on the wooden press itself, but Gutenberg's true stroke of genius was the type.
The metal letters.
Right. If you carve letters out of wood, the edges lose their sharpness after just a few dozen impressions under that heavy pressure. But if you cast letters in pure lead, the metal is too soft. The structural integrity just collapses.
So what was the magic formula? What did he figure out?
Gutenberg engineered a highly specific ternary alloy. It was lead, tin, and antimony.
Okay.
Lead provided the bulk and the low melting point. Tin added essential toughness to withstand the mechanical pressure. But the antimony was the absolute masterstroke.
How so? What does antimony do?
Antimony possesses this highly unusual physical property. It expands slightly as it cools and transitions from a liquid to a solid state.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So when Gutenberg poured his molten alloy into a tiny mold, the antimony forced the cooling metal outward, pushing it violently into every microscopic crevice of the letter's mold. This resulted in a type block with razor-sharp edges, capable of producing thousands of perfectly crisp impressions without degrading.
That is brilliant. But casting thousands of perfect letters requires a flawless mold. You can't hand-carve the mold for every single letter A and expect them all to be identical.
No, and to solve that, Gutenberg invented the hand mold. The process goes like this. First, a highly skilled punch cutter, utilizing the skills of a gem cutter or goldsmith, carves a perfect 3-dimensional letter backward on the end of a hard steel rod. This is called the punch.
So you have a single perfect master copy of the letter in steel.
Exactly. Next, you strike that hard steel punch into a softer block of metal, usually copper. This creates a deeply indented right-reading impression of the letter, and this piece of copper becomes the matrix.
And then the matrix goes into the hand mold.
Right. The matrix sits at the bottom of this adjustable 2-part metal mold. The founder pours the molten lead-tin antimony alloy into the top. It cools instantly. The antimony expands to catch every detail. The founder snaps the mold open, and out drops a perfectly uniform piece of type. You can cast hundreds of identical letters in an hour using the exact same matrix.
The sources estimate his complete typecase contained around 290 separate boxes. That accounts for uppercase, lowercase, punctuation, and all those specific ligatures, two letters joined together that scribes use to save space on the page, because Gutenberg wanted his printed pages to perfectly mimic the finest handwritten manuscripts.
He was competing with scribes, after all.
Yeah.
But putting perfect metal type against cheap paper introduced a massive chemical problem.
Right.
Traditional scribble ink was water-based. It utilized ingredients like oak galls or carbon soot mixed with water and a binder.
And if I take a metal stamp, coat it in watery ink, and press it onto thin paper, the water just pools on the metal and then violently bleaches through the paper fibers.
Yeah, the water-based ink smears immediately under mechanical pressure.
Yeah.
And worse, it soaks completely through the paper. If the ink bleeds through, you ruin the verso side of the page, completely destroying the primary geometric advantage of the codex.
Right, you can't read the back of the page, so Gutenberg had to become a chemist too.
He really did. He spent years developing a highly viscous oil-based ink. By boiling linseed oil with varnish and blending it with high-quality lampblack, which is just soot, he created an ink that behaved much more like an oil paint.
Okay, so it's thick and sticky.
Exactly. It adhered beautifully to the metal face of the type without pooling, and when pressed into the paper, it stayed on the surface without bleeding through.
So with the alloy, the hand mold, and the oil-based ink perfected, the only thing left was the machine to bring it all together. And I'd love to step inside a 15th century print shop, because I really want to convey just how intensely physical this process was to you listening. This wasn't delicate, quiet library work. This was loud, sweaty, dangerous industrial labor.
Oh, the print shop was an environment of extreme mechanical tension. The press itself was this massive timber structure. The classical standing mechanism could be up to 7 feet tall, 3 feet wide, and it often stretched across the room to stabilize itself against the ceiling beams.
And the source notes Gutenberg adapted this from classical Roman screw presses used for pressing grapes or olives.
Right, the agricultural screw press was a really ubiquitous technology. But Gutenberg couldn't just throw paper under a wine press.
Yeah, a wine press is designed to crush and extract. A printing press has to exert immense, perfectly even downward pressure and then immediately release it before the paper tears.
So he had to re-engineer the platen.
Which is the flat wooden board that actually presses down on the paper.
Exactly. The platen had to be perfectly level.
Hmm.
But the true genius was in the carriage mechanism below it. Gutenberg introduced a movable flatbed that allowed the heavy metal type to slide in and out from under the platen really swiftly.
Let's walk through a single pull of the press, because the workflow is a masterpiece of early ergonomics. It starts with the compositor standing at the typecase.
Right. The compositor holds this small wooden or metal tray called a composing stick. He reads the manuscript copy, and relying entirely on muscle memory, he blindly plucks individual metal letters from those 290 boxes, and he places them upside down and backward into the stick.
Wow.
Yeah, it's intense. Once he builds a few lines of text, he carefully slides them onto a longer tray called a galley. And once he has enough galleys to form the pages for one side of a large sheet of paper, he arranges them on a massive flat stone table.
And locks them all tightly together inside a heavy iron frame, which is called the form.
Right. This form, weighing perhaps 50 pounds and packed with thousands of individual pieces of lead, is carefully hoisted onto the sliding bed of the press.
Now comes the part of the process that is just incredibly visceral to me. You have to get that thick, sticky, oil-based ink onto the metal type.
And you definitely don't paint it on, you beat it on.
Using the ink balls. The sources mention these were heavy, wooden-handled tools ending in these round leather pads, and they were stuffed tightly with wool or horsehair. But the leather wasn't always standard calfskin. The texts specifically mention they frequently used dogskin.
Wait, dogskin?
Yes. Dogskin was favored by some printers because it reportedly had fewer pores, which prevented the oil ink from soaking too deeply into the pad.
That is so specific, but it makes mechanical sense.
Imagine the scene. A massive timber press creaking, a man holding two huge dogskin balls covered in thick black oil, mashing them together to distribute the ink, and then violently beating them across the surface of the metal type. The smell of boiled linseed oil and horsehair must have been overpowering.
It was an exhausting, rhythmic physical exertion. And while the beater is inking the type, the puller is preparing the paper. He takes a single sheet of paper, which has actually been lightly dampened with water so the fibers better accept the oil ink, and he mounts it onto a frame called the tympan.
And to make sure the paper doesn't shift, it's pierced onto tiny metal pins. But you also don't want ink getting on the clean margins of the paper.
Right. To protect the margins, the puller uses a frisket. This is a thin, hinged frame covered in parchment or thick paper with precise holes cut out exactly where the text blocks are located.
So you fold the frisket down over the timpan. Then you fold that entire assembly down over the inked metal form. The paper is now sandwiched between the timpan and the frisket, hovering just millimeters above the wet type.
The puller then turns a crank, called a rounce, wrapping a leather strap around a windlass to smoothly slide the entire heavy bed under the massive wooden platen.
And here's the climax of the movement. The puller grabs a long wooden handle attached to the central screw, the bar, and pulls back with his entire body weight.
The thick wooden screw drives the platen down with hundreds of pounds of force. The paper is forced into the inked metal. Then, crucially, the system has a built-in elasticity. The timpan springs slightly, the puller releases the bar, and the platen lifts cleanly without dragging or smudging the fresh print.
He cranks the bed back out, flips open the timpan, lifts the frisket, and pulls off a perfectly printed page.
And then they just do it again.
The productivity metrics on this process are almost unbelievable. The text references a 1568 woodcut showing a typical duo one-beater, one-puller. Through pure synchronized muscle memory, a skilled duo could execute 14,000 hand movements in a single working day.
14,000. And the output of those movements is what changed the world. By 1600, a standard European printing press was capable of producing up to 3,600 printed pages per day.
3,600 pages. Let's ground that number. If you are a medieval scribe working from dawn to dusk, you might finish a few pages a day. It's a 100-fold increase in productivity realized almost overnight. It's as if someone invented a car that could suddenly drive at 6,000 miles per hour. The social fabric simply cannot absorb that kind of acceleration without tearing.
Which is exactly why Gutenberg's attempt to keep the technology a trade secret failed so spectacularly. By 1455, Gutenberg had printed his famous 42-line Bible, which was a masterpiece that proved movable type could rival the aesthetic beauty of illuminated manuscripts.
Right.
But soon after, he fell into bankruptcy and lost his equipment to his investor, Johann Fust.
And once the knowledge escaped that workshop in Mainz, it just went viral.
The spread was a geographical explosion. German printers, carrying the secrets of the hand mold and the alloy, migrated along the trade routes. Within a few decades, print shops appeared in over 200 cities across a dozen European countries.
And Italy became the absolute epicenter. By 1500, print shops had been established in 77 different Italian cities, and Venice alone accounted for 1/3 of all Italian printing.
Wow.
Yeah, Venice was essentially the Silicon Valley of the 15th century.
The Venetian printers, like the famous Aldus Manutius, began standardizing formats. They introduced smaller, portable books, which were basically the ancestors of the modern paperback, and they developed new typefaces like italic. And the sheer volume of output is just difficult to comprehend.
The sources give us the data. Before Gutenberg, all of Europe possessed maybe a few tens of thousands of manuscript books, closely guarded in monasteries and elite private libraries. By 1500, just 50 years after the press went online, Western Europe had produced over 20 million volumes.
20 million. And the acceleration didn't stop there. In the 16th century, output grew nearly tenfold. Estimates suggest between 150 to 200 million copies were printed in that century alone.
Going from a world of total information scarcity to 200 million circulating books birthed entirely new social phenomena. Like, we get the very first viral authors.
The Dutch philosopher Erasmus is a prime example of this. He recognized the power of the press incredibly early on. Between 1469 and 1536, at least 750,000 copies of his works were sold.
That's huge.
It is. He became an intellectual celebrity on a scale that was previously impossible.
But even Erasmus looks quaint compared to Martin Luther. Luther fundamentally weaponized the printing press against the most powerful institution on earth, the Catholic Church.
The Reformation is the ultimate case study in the disruptive power of mass communication. When Luther posted his 95 Theses in 1517, he likely didn't anticipate the mechanical response. Printers quickly translated his Latin arguments into German, printed them on cheap broadsheets, and distributed them everywhere.
The numbers from the text are staggering. Between 1518 and 1520 alone, 300,000 printed copies of Luther's tracts flooded Germany. Peddlers sold them in town squares from handcarts. He completely bypassed the ecclesiastical hierarchy. The papacy and the Holy Roman Emperor were effectively blindsided because they were trying to fight a 16th century information war with 15th century censorship tools.
So what does this all mean? If we return to Elizabeth Eisenstein's concept of the agent of change, we see how the press literally restructured core human institutions. Like, let's look at the scientific revolution.
Before the printing press, science was totally hamstrung by the drift of hand copying.
Exactly. If a brilliant astronomer in Prague spends a lifetime charting the orbit of Mars and hand draws the diagrams, the scribe who copies that book for a university in Paris will inevitably make a mistake.
Right, they're human.
They'll miscopy a number or shift a line in the diagram by a millimeter, and then the scribe copying that copy makes another mistake. By the time the data reaches London, it is scientifically useless. You cannot build a cumulative body of knowledge on corrupted data.
But the printing press introduces the concept of typographical fixity.
Yes. For the first time in human history, 1,000 copies of a book are perfectly mechanically identical. A scientist in Paris and a scientist in London can look at the exact same table of logarithms on the exact same page number, knowing the data is identical.
Which allows for peer review.
Exactly. It creates a unified international community of scientists who can confidently build upon each other's verified discoveries. The scientific revolution does not happen without typographical fixity.
The press also effectively rewired language itself. Our sources highlight a massive shift toward printing in the vernacular everyday spoken languages like German, French, and English.
Latin had been the universal language of the elite, the clergy, and the university. But let's be real, printers are capitalists. The market for Latin texts was finite. To sell 200 million books, you have to print in the languages the urban middle classes actually speak.
And by printing thousands of identical copies of a French or German text, the printers unintentionally became linguistic dictators.
They anchored the languages. Before print, spelling and grammar were highly regional. A word might be spelled 5 different ways depending on which village you lived in. But when a massive print shop in London publishes a popular English Bible or a legal text, their specific spelling conventions become the de facto standard.
Right.
Printing froze the vernacular languages in place, elevating them to the status of Latin.
The historians Fev and Martin argue this linguistic standardization was the driving force behind the rise of European nationalism.
Right.
When millions of dispersed people are reading the same news in the exact same standardized language, they begin to conceptualize themselves as a unified nation rather than just subjects of a local lord.
And the economic benefits of adopting this technology were highly quantifiable. The source text references the work of economist Jeremiah Dittmar, who mapped the adoption of the printing press against urban growth.
I love this data point.
It's so good.
Dittmar found that European cities that adopted a printing press in the late 1400s grew approximately 60% faster than comparable cities that did not adopt the press over the following century.
A 60% growth premium is massive. A print shop functioned as an intellectual and economic anchor. It attracted highly skilled labor translators, editors, mechanics, paper merchants. It facilitated double-entry bookkeeping and commercial law, accelerating trade. It was the ultimate infrastructural advantage.
But of course, no disruptive technology arrives without immense cultural anxiety. When you look at the elite reaction to the printing press, it feels eerily familiar. The 15th century tech panic perfectly mirrors how we react to the internet, social media, or artificial intelligence today.
Oh, the fear of losing control over the flow of information is this historical constant. The traditional gatekeepers, the clergy, the elite scholars, the master scribes, they were terrified.
Let's bring in some of the loudest critics from the source material. We have Filippo de Strada, a Dominican friar writing around 1473. He didn't just dislike the press, he found it morally repugnant.
De Strada famously characterized the printing press as a whore, directly contrasting it with what he called the virgin pen of the hand-copying scribe.
Oh.
Yeah, he argued that printers were driven purely by profit, churning out cheap, vulgar texts that corrupted classical scholarship. He viewed the democratization of reading as a total degradation of culture.
Then you have Johannes Trithemius, a Benedictine abbot who wrote a highly defensive treatise in 1492 titled In Praise of Scribes. Trithemius presented a multi-layered attack on the press. First, he argued the physical substrate was inferior. He claimed paper books would decay in a few generations, whereas parchment manuscripts would last a millennium.
Which, ironically, He had to have printed on a press to ensure his complaints reached a wide audience.
The irony wasn't lost on his contemporaries, but Trathimus's most profound argument was spiritual. He believed that the manual act of copying a sacred text was a spiritual discipline. The exhaustion, the focus, the physical devotion of the scribe was woven into the holiness of the book.
He feared that a machine, thoughtlessly stamping out Bibles, stripped the text of its soul and would render the monks intellectually lazy.
Beyond the spiritual panic, there was a massive fear of rampant misinformation. The Florentine humanist Niccolò Perotti complained in 1470 that the world was being flooded with badly inaccurate texts. Girolamo Scorsafico claimed that most printers were illiterate mechanics blindly arranging metal blocks they didn't even understand.
The anxiety was that anyone with a press could publish anything. The vetting process of the university or the monastery was totally gone. Uneducated printers were accused of spreading religious heterodoxy and scientific errors because the financial incentive to publish quickly completely overrode the mandate to publish accurately.
It is the exact same conversation we are having right now about algorithmic news feeds prioritizing engagement over accuracy or AI generating hallucinatory articles. The fear that the masses cannot be trusted to sift through an unfiltered avalanche of data is not new, it is half a millennium old.
But the avalanche could not be stopped. The press soon escaped the borders of Europe. However, its global expansion was not solely driven by commercial trade, it was frequently pioneered by religious missionaries.
The Jesuits in particular recognized that if they wanted to proselytize the globe, they needed the ultimate mass communication tool.
The Jesuits established the first printing press in Asia, located in Goa, India, in 1556. A printer named Juan de Bustamante was sent with the machine. Fascinatingly, this press was originally destined for Abyssinia, modern-day Ethiopia, but the Patriarch Designate was persuaded to stay in Goa during a stopover, effectively rerouting the technological timeline of the entire region.
A completely random historical detour, and the Jesuits pushed further east. A Portuguese Jesuit named Diogo de Mesquita acquired a press while visiting Europe and physically transported it all the way to Nagasaki, Japan, arriving in 1586.
It was utilized to print ecclesiastical works in Japanese characters and Latin until Mesquita's death in 1614. In the Philippines, the Dominicans led the charge, establishing a press and publishing the Doctrina Christiana in 1593. The religious orders weaponized Gutenberg's invention for ideological expansion.
But the technology wasn't universally embraced upon arrival. The source text highlights a very specific and prolonged resistance within the Ottoman Empire.
The Ottoman adoption of the press is a brilliant study in how technology collides with culture. Non-Muslim minorities within the empire adopted it quickly. Sephardi Jews, fleeing the Spanish Inquisition, established a Hebrew press in Constantinople as early as 1493. They were followed by Armenian printers in 1567 and Greek presses in 1627.
But the Muslim majority largely banned printing in Arabic script for over 2 centuries. Why?
The resistance was twofold. Culturally, Islamic society held the art of calligraphy in the highest possible esteem. The handwritten word, particularly the Quran, was considered a pinnacle of artistic and spiritual expression. The rigid, blocky output of early movable type was viewed as deeply aesthetically offensive to the holy text.
And typographically, the Arabic script is incredibly complex to mechanize compared to the Latin alphabet.
Exactly. Arabic is highly cursive. Letters change their physical shape depending on their position in a word, whether they are at the beginning, middle, or end. A single letter might require 4 separate metal punches.
Oh, wow.
Furthermore, the letters must connect seamlessly. Attempting to chop a flowing, cursive script into discrete rectangular blocks of lead creates massive logistical headaches and results in ugly typography. The first press to print an Arabic script for a Muslim readership wasn't established until 1729 by Ibrahim Bouteflika, and even then it faced immense friction.
Okay, let's fast forward and look at the machine itself, because here is where it gets really interesting from an engineering perspective. For nearly 350 years after Gutenberg, the actual physical technology of the press barely evolved.
It's a remarkable technological plateau. The wooden screw press that pulled 3,600 pages a day in 1600 was largely the exact same mechanism being used in 1750. There were minor tweaks, sure. By 1550, some mechanics replaced the wooden screws with metal ones for durability.
The text mentions a Dutch cartographer named Willem Blauw in the 1620s.
Blauw introduced a press with a redesigned hose, which is the mechanism that guides the spindle, and a smoother track for the sliding bed. These cumulative tweaks perhaps tripled the output over Gutenberg's original numbers, but you were still ultimately relying on a human being violently pulling a lever to mash flat paper against flat metal.
But as the 18th century closes and the 19th century dawns, the world enters the Industrial Revolution. Populations in cities like London and New York are exploding. The public demands daily news, up-to-the-minute stock prices, serialized novels. The wooden hand press hits its absolute physical limit. You simply cannot muscle your way to a daily newspaper circulation of 50,000.
The bottleneck had returned. And to break it, the engineers had to fundamentally abandon Gutenberg's materials. Enter cast iron and Lord Stanhope.
Around 1800, Lord Stanhope introduces the first printing press constructed entirely out of cast iron. Why is iron the necessary leap?
Wood flexes. When a printer pulls the bar on a wooden press, a significant percentage of that kinetic energy is lost to the bending and creaking of the timber frame. Cast iron is incredibly rigid. Almost 100% of the force applied to the lever is transferred directly into downward pressure on the paper.
And because it's stronger, you can print a larger surface area.
Stanhope's iron press allowed printers to double the size of the printed sheet. It also introduced a system of compound levers, which reduced the physical force required by the pressman by 90%. Output jumped to about 480 pages per hour.
480 pages an hour is great, but you are still bottlenecked by human endurance. To reach industrial scale, you have to remove human muscle from the equation entirely.
Which brings us to the integration of steam power, driven by a German engineer named Friedrich Koenig in 1814. Koenig realized that the flat platen, the heavy flat plate pressing down on the paper, was mathematically inefficient. Squishing two massive flat surfaces together requires immense force and time.
So Koenig completely reimagines the physics of the impression.
He abandons the flat platen entirely. Instead, he replaces it with a rotating cylinder. The metal type remains on a flat bed, but it is hooked up to a steam engine that rapidly slides the bed back and forth. A sheet of paper is wrapped around the rotating cylinder, and as the flat bed of type slides underneath, the cylinder rolls over it, kissing the paper to the ink.
A rolling cylinder requires a fraction of the pressure of a flat plate because only a thin line of paper is touching the type at any given millisecond.
It is a brilliant mechanical solution. Koenig partnered with engineer Andreas Bauer, and they sold their first steam-powered cylinder press to the Times of London. In November 1814, the Times rolled off the press at a rate of 1,100 impressions per hour. They soon modified it to print on both sides of the sheet simultaneously. This machine effectively birthed the era of the mass-market daily newspaper.
We went from pulling a wooden lever for 3,600 pages a day to a steam engine churning out 1,100 pages an hour. But even the flatbed cylinder press had a speed limit. The heavy flatbed of metal type still had to slide forward, stop, and slide violently backward. The inertia of moving hundreds of pounds of lead back and forth caps your maximum speed.
To go faster, you have to eliminate the backward motion. You have to make the entire process continuous. You need rotary motion.
This is the final boss of mechanical printing. The rotary press, invented by an American, Richard M. Hoe, in 1843.
Hoe's concept was terrifyingly ambitious. He wanted to take the heavy, flat metal type and mount it directly onto a massive, rapidly spinning central cylinder.
But wait, how does that work? Metal type blocks are perfectly rectangular. If you put rectangular blocks onto a curved cylinder and spin it at high speeds, centrifugal force will instantly blast heavy lead letters across the room like shrapnel.
That was the defining engineering hurdle. Hoe solved the centrifugal force problem with a brilliant piece of metallurgy. He invented wedge-shaped column rules. These were specially tapered strips of metal placed between the columns of type. When locked tightly together, the wedges clamp the rectangular type blocks securely against the curve of the cylinder, allowing it to spin at violent speeds without the type flying off.
That is incredible, and because the type is now on a spinning drum, you don't have to feed individual sheets of paper anymore.
Exactly. The rotary press enabled the transition to continuous rolls of paper, which is known as web printing. Miles of continuous paper could be fed through a gauntlet of spinning type cylinders and inking rollers, and then mechanically cut and folded at the very end of the line.
The scale of Richard Hoe's rotary press is mind-bending. His early designs hit 8,000 pages an hour. But the sources note that by 1891, the continuous roll web presses utilized by papers like the New York World were producing 90,000 four-page sheets every single hour.
90,000 sheets an hour. That scale completely democratized information. It made the daily newspaper a disposable commodity available to the entire working class for literally pennies.
From there, the 20th century abandons Gutenberg's core concept of physical metal type entirely. We move into offset printing, where the image is transferred from a plate to a rubber blanket and then to the paper, eliminating metal to paperware. Then the 1960s bring phototype setting, using flashes of light on photographic paper to set text. And finally, the digital lasers and inkjet nozzles of today.
But the DNA of the impulse remains identical. Every mechanical leap, from the dogskin ink balls to the wedge-shaped column rules to the modern laser, is driven by the exact same human desire: to reproduce our thoughts faster, cheaper, and further.
It is a monumental arc. We tracked a technology that started as a repurposed medieval wine press, engineered by a goldsmith trying to win a lawsuit, and watched it evolve into a steam-powered iron behemoth that standardized national languages, verified the scientific revolution, and unleashed a 500-year era of the printed word.
It really is the architecture of the modern mind. But, our deep dive into these sources leaves us with a highly provocative thought experiment about the present moment. The text repeatedly emphasizes Elizabeth Eisenstein's observation that the printing press caused a profound psychological shift. It transitioned humanity from a hearing public to a reading public.
Right. Before the press, information was communal. You gathered in the town square or the church to hear someone read a rare manuscript aloud. Gutenberg privatized knowledge. He created the silent, isolated reader, absorbing standardized text alone in their room.
For 5 centuries, our legal systems, our educational models, and our entire conception of truth have been built on the supremacy of the silent printed word. But consider the format of this very analysis. You are consuming this highly researched, complex information right now without reading a single word. You are listening to an audio medium.
We are broadcasting spoken language directly to you.
This raises a critical question as we look at the explosion of podcasts, digital audio, and video platforms. Are these digital mediums pulling us back to our pre-Gutenberg roots? Are we transitioning back into a hearing public? We are returning to the communal oral traditions of storytelling and debate, only now on a massive global digital scale.
And if the shift to the standardized printed word fundamentally rewired the neurology and sociology of 15th century Europe, how will the shift back away from it, back toward the fluid spoken word, alter the trajectory of human thought next?
It suggests that the Gutenberg era might not be the final state of human communication, but merely a 500-year technological parenthesis.
That is an incredibly powerful idea to end on. As the chaotic, muddy waters of our own modern technological revolution continue to swirl, we have to wonder if we aren't just accelerating blindly forward, but perhaps, in some profound ways, spiraling back to exactly where we started. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the sources. Keep questioning the mechanics of the world around you, and we'll see you next time.